If you lived in ancient Rome and belonged to the elite, your relationship with food would be very different from that of the rest of the population. For the wealthiest Romans, meals were not just a time to satisfy hunger, but rather a social, political, and even theatrical experience. Eating well meant more than simply enjoying delicious dishes. It was a way to demonstrate power, status, and influence over those around you. A Roman banquet was not just about the food, it was a true spectacle, carefully planned to impress and establish a position in society. The homes of the patricians, members of the high Roman aristocracy, had large tricliniums, luxuriously decorated dining rooms where guests did not sit at the table, but rather reclined on divans, like true gods enjoying the delights of the earth. The act of eating lying down, with the body supported on one arm, was not just a whim. It was a sign of sophistication and wealth. Slaves were in charge of serving each dish and keeping the wine flowing. But this ostentatious ritual went far beyond the body posture or the refined setting. Imagine walking into one of these dinners. In the center of the room, tables adorned with gold-embroidered tablecloths, adorned with ice sculptures and floral arrangements that exuded exotic perfumes. Torchlight flickered, reflecting off silver goblets and Egyptian glass jugs. Around them, guests chatted, joked, and discussed politics, always careful to ensure that their words and gestures conveyed authority. The food, however, was the real center of attention. The delicacies served were meticulously chosen to surprise and even shock. The more exotic and rare a meal, the more impressive the host's position would be. And don't think that this was just a delicious meal. The dishes were true works of art. A dinner might begin with delicate appetizers, such as deviled eggs with elaborate sauces, small portions of smoked fish, or fresh oysters brought from distant colonies. But that was just the beginning. A Roman banquet was, above all, a display of abundance, and the main courses needed to convey that opulence. Imagine a large roast boar, stuffed with smaller birds, and served on a platter decorated with bay leaves. Or an entire peacock, carefully prepared so that its lush feathers remained intact, as if it were about to fly off the table. The wealthy Romans did not just eat these dishes, they displayed them as trophies, as proof that their power extended to even the most extravagant flavors. But Roman banquets were not just about food. They involved entertainment, performances, and status contests among the guests. Poets recited verses, musicians played enchanting melodies, and even philosophers were invited to debate ideas while everyone enjoyed rare delicacies. Wine, always present, was served in exquisite glasses and often mixed with honey or spices to create unique flavors. Guests toasted each other, not just in celebration, but as a gesture of reaffirmation of alliances and social influence. Now stop and imagine the contrast. While the poorest struggled to secure a piece of brown bread and a little olive oil, the elite indulged in eating until exhaustion. Yes, because many wealthy Romans didn't just eat heartily. They had a peculiar and controversial custom. After ingesting large quantities of food, some would go to a special room, known as the vomitorium, where they would induce vomiting in order to continue eating. For them, a banquet would not end until all the delicacies had been tasted, and the only way to continue was to clear the space. But it wasn't all just excess and ostentation. Roman cuisine had fascinating secrets and flavor combinations that to us may seem unusual, but were highly appreciated at the time. The use of fermented sauces, aromatic herbs from the East, and sophisticated cooking techniques made each meal a unique sensory event. And anyone who thinks that the elite were satisfied with just meat and wine is mistaken. The patricians' diet included a huge variety of fruits, refined breads, and aged cheeses, all carefully selected to complement the gastronomic experience. As the dishes were served and the conversation flowed, The guests knew that they were participating in something more than just a simple dinner. They were part of a ritual of power, where each bite was an affirmation of status, and each sip of wine reinforced their position in the Roman hierarchy. Being present at an elite banquet was not just a privilege. It was an opportunity to solidify alliances, close deals, and secure future favors. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to be in this hall, surrounded by senators, generals, and influential figures of Rome? Which dish would catch your attention the most? And how would you feel when faced with so much extravagance? If you were invited to a banquet hosted by a Roman patrician, you wouldn't expect to find anything ordinary on the table. The elite of Rome didn't just eat. They transformed food into a spectacle, a way of demonstrating their superiority and wealth. To do this, it wasn't enough to just have plenty. It was necessary to surprise. And what better way to impress guests than by serving dishes that seemed to have come straight out of an extravagant tale? The more exotic and rare the delicacy, the greater the prestige of the host. Roman banquets were planned months in advance. It wasn't enough to have an abundance of food. Each dish had to reflect the opulence of the host and the complexity of flavors that only the wealthiest could enjoy. Eating was not a simple necessity. It was an event, a spectacle carefully orchestrated to leave the guests ecstatic. Now, imagine the scene. A grand hall lit by golden torches, where the aromas of exotic spices mingle with the scent of fresh flowers scattered throughout the room. Luxurious cushions line the marble beds where the guests recline, eagerly awaiting the next culinary marvel. Slaves dressed in fine robes file in, carrying richly decorated golden trays. The momentary silence in the room gives way to whispers of admiration and looks of surprise. Among the succulent meats and fragrant side dishes, one delicacy stands out, eliciting expressions of pure amazement from those present. On the tray, carefully seasoned and prepared, are flamingo tongues. Yes, you heard that right, but why flamingo tongues? The flavor itself was not the main factor. The real reason was the difficulty of obtaining the ingredient. Flamingos were not found everywhere, and capturing enough of them to prepare a dish worthy of a banquet was a complex and expensive task. Only the wealthiest and most influential could afford to serve such a delicacy. The Roman belief that the texture of the flamingo's tongue was unique only increased its value. It was considered soft, delicate, and capable of absorbing seasonings in an exceptional way. The dish was slowly cooked in a refined mixture of honey, vinegar, and rare herbs, creating a perfect balance between sweet and sour, a contrast of flavors that awakened the senses. For the guests, each bite was an exotic and unforgettable experience. Now think about it. How many flamingos would it take to satisfy a table full of senators, generals, and aristocrats? This was the essence of Roman ostentation. The excess, the waste, the clear demonstration that the host had inexhaustible resources to afford a luxury that few could even imagine. After all, when you have money to spare, why settle for something ordinary? But flamingos were not the only birds to feature at the banquets of the elite. Peacocks, for example, were not only eaten, but also part of the feast's decoration. Sometimes they were served whole, with their lush feathers carefully reattached after cooking, giving the illusion that the bird was still alive. The visual impact of this dish was immense. Imagine the fascinated looks of guests upon seeing a golden peacock, its succulent flesh perfumed with exotic spices and herbs. The very image of the bird, with its tail reconstituted and spread out like a fan, was a symbol of wealth and extravagance. Roman chefs took the presentation of dishes to another level. In addition to gilding the peacocks with edible gold leaf, some banquets featured birds stuffed inside other birds in a kind of gastronomic matryoshka. A smaller bird, such as a thrush or a partridge, was stuffed inside a chicken, which in turn was placed inside a duck, then inside a peacock, and finally inside a pig. When the dish was cut in front of the guests, it revealed a cascade of layers of succulent meat, each layer soaked in the juices and spices of the previous one. And it didn't stop there. Swans and ostriches were also among the birds prized by the elite. Although less common, they were considered a true luxury. The swan, a symbol of elegance, was a dish fit for emperors, slowly roasted and served with sauces made with wine and honey. The ostrich, a gigantic bird brought from the provinces of North Africa, was served on special occasions. Its meat was prepared with elaborate sauces made with wine, honey, and black pepper, a rare and valuable spice at the time. The bird's large legs were roasted whole and served on enormous platters, a sight worthy of an emperor. And speaking of emperors, Lucullus himself, one of Rome's most famous generals and known for his legendary banquets, used to say that a good meal should leave guests astonished, whether by its flavor, presentation, or excessive luxury. At one of his banquets, he served a dish that shocked everyone: ostrich eggs cooked in donkey's milk and seasoned with saffron, a very expensive spice. The sophistication of these dishes was not only in their flavor, but in the meaning behind each one. Eating these birds was not just a matter of gastronomic appreciation, but a symbol of power and status. It meant that the host had contacts to import rare ingredients, that he could afford the best cooks, and that he did not worry about scarcity. While the common people of Rome struggled to get a piece of pork or a simple loaf of bread, the patricians delighted in banquets worthy of the gods. The guests who left these parties were not only satisfied, they were impressed, commenting for weeks about the exotic dishes and the opulence of the event. After all, in Rome, more than feeding the body, a banquet needed to feed the reputation. Now, imagine yourself sitting at this banquet, watching the dishes being served, listening to the enthusiastic comments of the guests, and smelling the exotic aromas that filled the room. Your gaze travels around the table, admiring the extravagant dishes before you. Would you try the flamingo tongue? Would you dare to try the tender peacock meat? Or would you think it was all unnecessary excess? After all, what is luxury for some can be pure nonsense for others. Imagine yourself in a grand banquet hall with great marble columns and soft lighting that reflects the golden glow of silver and crystal goblets. The aroma of meat roasting over the fire mixes with the scent of exotic herbs and spices that waft through the air, creating an almost magical atmosphere. In the center of the table is a breathtaking sight: enormous platters of freshly roasted exotic animal meat with that golden sheen that only the wealth of Rome could provide. These are not simple cuts of beef or pork. We are talking about camel meat, lions, tigers, and even elephants, animals that were hunted during Rome's long military campaigns and brought from the most remote parts of the empire, all to satisfy the most extravagant desires of the patricians. Roman banquets were more than just meals. They were a display of power, opulence, and dominance. By serving these exotic meats, Roman hosts were making it clear that they had access to distant lands and immense riches. Camel meat, for example, was brought directly from Middle Eastern caravans, a luxurious gift sent as tribute from far-off regions. But it was not just about having the meat, but how to prepare it. Imagine the scenario. Camel meat, which by its nature has a strong and distinctive flavor, was cooked with complex spices such as cumin, cinnamon, and cloves, seasonings that could only be acquired through trade with Egypt and the East. The aim was to soften the intense flavor of the meat, creating a unique sensory experience. The camel, often roasted for hours, was served with a sweet mixture of honey and dried fruits, a tasty contrast that delighted the most discerning palates. These banquets were replete with a mixture of meats and exotic game, such as lions, tigers, and even elephants, which were slaughtered in the arenas during gladiatorial combats. When the fights were over, the meat of these animals was carefully prepared and served as a way to demonstrate the abundance of the empire. A lion, which had been a fierce adversary in the arena, was now a rare delicacy on the tables of the richest, transformed into a succulent and sophisticated dish. But how was this possible? How did the Romans manage to hunt these beasts and keep them fresh for a feast? The answer lay in the incredible logistics and transportation system that the Roman Empire had developed. The Roman legions, spread throughout the empire, did not just fight. They were responsible for ensuring that luxury goods, such as exotic meats, reached the tables of the powerful in Rome. Cities such as Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch were hubs from where the most valuable resources, such as large animals, were sent to Rome on large cargo ships. At the banquet, the meat of lions, tigers, and leopards was not served simply. The most noble cuts were seasoned with sweet wine and fine herbs, creating an unusual combination that reflected the refinement of Roman culture. The secret was in the presentation. The meat was cut into thin slices and served with sauces that ranged from honey with Falerno wine to a spicy seasoning of black pepper and salt. When faced with a table like this, anyone knew that they were in for a unique gastronomic experience. However, Roman ostentation was not limited to exotic animals. Another deeply rooted tradition at Roman banquets was to serve meat from animals from gladiatorial games, which, contrary to what many people might imagine, were not just a form of entertainment or brutality, but also an element of prestige for the elite. During the great games in the arena of Pompey or the Colosseum, animals such as elephants, rhinos, and even African buffalo were captured and then transported to Rome to be displayed, but also to be transformed into sumptuous dishes on the tables of the powerful. These animals, after undergoing epic combats, were consumed by the upper classes as a symbol of strength and greatness. Elephant meat, for example, which was sometimes served at imperial banquets, was slow roasted and seasoned with a sauce made of wine and spices. Even at the banquet, the idea was to maintain grandeur. By serving a dish of lion or tiger meat, the host was telling his guests that he had the power to bring the most feared of predators to his table. It was not just the food that was being served, it was a display of total dominance. Now imagine the scene. You're at a Roman banquet with platters of exotic meats being placed on the table. The smell of lion meat mixed with the perfume of herbs spreads through the hall. Around you, the conversations of senators and generals are drowned out by the grandeur of the moment. The succulent meat of the bird and the golden glow of the roast camel are before you. How would you react to such luxury and extravagance? Would you feel the pressure to eat, to be like these great names of Rome? Or would you think that all of this is unnecessary exaggeration? The most intriguing thing is that, contrary to what many people think, not everyone saw this excess as something positive. There were voices within the Roman elite itself who said that all this ostentation was distancing themselves from true Roman virtue, which above all preached moderation and simplicity. But on the other hand, the most powerful saw these banquets as a way to solidify their position at the top of the social pyramid. When looking at these grand scenes of banquets and exotic meats, the question remains: how much of this grandeur was really about the pleasure of food, and how much was just a display of power? What would be your opinion of the banquets of the Romans? Do you believe that the food served at that time was a true gastronomic art, or, as many said, just a reflection of the exaggerated pride of a society in decline? In a grand city like Rome, where power and wealth were represented at every turn, banquets were not just about the food, they were a showcase of opulence. And what could be more dazzling to impress guests than luxurious fish and seafood? The Roman elite had at their disposal rare delicacies from the farthest reaches of the empire, reflecting not only social status, but also skill and power to control the seas. Among the most coveted foods were garum, the famous fermented fish sauce, and the many varieties of fish and shellfish. But garum, in particular, was more than just a sauce. It was a symbol of sophistication, wealth, and access to exclusive ingredients. What's more, its production was an art in itself, with secret recipes passed down from generation to generation, used by chefs who mastered the craft of Roman cuisine. This sauce was made by fermenting fish, usually the entrails of fish such as anchovies, mixing it with salt, and then leaving it to ferment in the sun for weeks or even months in large ceramic barrels. The whole process might seem unbearable to those who were not used to it, but for the Romans, this sauce was the key to a unique gastronomic experience. Garum was the equivalent of a luxury condiment, and its robust and complex flavor was used to season meat, fish, soups, and even vegetable dishes. But as with many other luxury products, the quality of garum was directly related to its origin and its rarity. The most refined version, produced in the coastal regions of Hispania and North Africa, was considered a true treasure and was exported throughout the empire. Garumarias were places specialized in the production of this sauce and were highly valued, both in Rome and in the provinces. At a typical meal of the Roman elite, garum was not served alone. It was paired with other equally precious seafood. Imagine a table laden with fresh oysters, lobsters, and lampreys, all carefully prepared to create a unique taste experience. Oysters, for example, were harvested directly from the seas around Britain or Gaul, and when served fresh, they were served with a special touch of sweet wine or wine vinegar, which enhanced their soft texture and salty flavor. These oysters were a true luxury, served raw to preserve their freshness. And what about lobsters? These sea creatures, brought directly from the Mediterranean Sea, were a true extravagance, representing the Romans' relentless search for the rare and exotic. If you were present at one of these Roman banquets, you would probably have come across a scene like this. Huge platters full of fresh shellfish, dazzling oysters on ice, accompanied by sauces and spices that created unexpected contrasts. When serving these dishes, the Romans sought not only to impress, but to provide an unforgettable sensory experience for their guests. It was a spectacle of colors, textures, and flavors that danced on the palate. And it was not just about the food, but also a clear demonstration of the power and prestige of the person offering the meal. But the luxury did not stop there. The Romans were always looking for rare seafood to add to their tables. On some occasions, exotic fish such as sea bream and barracuda were served whole, with their vivid eyes still shining under the candlelight, as a display of freshness. And here, it is worth highlighting the high-quality garum, which became the perfect condiment for these dishes. More than just a sauce, garum was a symbol of sophistication and culture. The Roman elite not only consumed these rare ingredients, but also invested large amounts of money to ensure that their banquets included the best, most sophisticated, and most expensive seafood. These banquets were so grand that some of them became true social and political events, where prestige and status were always at stake. Generals, senators, emperors, and wealthy patricians gathered not only to enjoy the delicacies, but also to establish alliances and demonstrate their power through what they were serving. Did you know that at some of these banquets, the amount of garum served could be so abundant that some Romans would even drink the garum straight? Such was the level of devotion and appreciation for this delicacy. And what can we learn from this search for rarity and sophistication? For the Romans, it was not just about feeding the body, but about feeding the ego, showing off the wealth and power of those at the table. Each ingredient, from the simplest fish to the most sophisticated oyster, was a reflection of a society that lived to impress and be impressed. Now, think for a moment. What would it be like to be at one of these banquets, amid the glitter of silver goblets, with rare seafood before you and the sound of political and social chatter all around you? If you were invited, would you choose the high-quality garum, or would you prefer something simpler? What would impress you more? The rare seafood, the exuberance of the oysters, or the aroma of garum that hung in the air? Perhaps, when you reflect on these questions, the grandeur of a Roman banquet reveals much more than just the food. It reveals the essence of ostentation and politics of that time. The Romans, at their luxurious banquets, were not only feeding themselves but reinventing themselves, making it clear to everyone around them that nothing was more important than the display of their power and their ability to keep the empire at its peak. After all, if the food reflected the wealth of the empire, what did that say about the men and women who prepared and consumed it? Have you ever wondered what the Roman elite ate at the end of a banquet when the meats and seafood had been savored and the main courses had finally been digested? In the grand setting of ancient Rome, true sophistication lay not only in the exotic dishes and rare meats, but also in the more subtle details, such as the breads, cheeses, wines, and fruits. These items, which today may seem simple, were in fact true luxury items that made the banquets of high society stand out among the most grandiose and ostentatious. Let's start with bread. In a society where simple food was the rule for the majority of the population, the bread consumed by the wealthy in Rome was a spectacle in itself. Unlike the common bread consumed by the common people, the white bread of the Roman elite was made with pure wheat flour, which gave it a superior texture and flavor. Wheat bread was softer and lighter, while wholemeal bread was more rustic and was reserved for the lower classes. The bread that reached the tables of the Roman patricians was always of impeccable quality, made by master bakers who used fresh ingredients and careful fermentation methods. In addition, bread served as a status symbol. It was eaten with the best accompaniments, such as fine cheeses and olive oils, and could be served as part of sophisticated starters or even as a side dish for main courses. Speaking of fine cheeses, ancient Rome had a huge variety of cheeses made with goat's milk or sheep's milk, some of them so delicate and refined that they were aged for months or even years. These cheeses were consumed in small portions as a true delicacy, since their production was limited and the demand was enormous. Cheeses such as Pecorino Romano were highly prized, known for their creamy texture and strong flavor. For wealthy Romans, cheese was not only a delicacy with a refined flavor, but also a form of ostentation. Like bread, cheese was a prestigious item, especially those that had been aged for a long time, considered something extremely rare and of great value on the market. Now, wine. It is no surprise that Falerno wine was the favorite of the Roman elite. This wine was considered one of the best in the world, and its fame was far from exaggerated. Produced in the Lazio region, this wine was rich, complex, and had an unmistakable flavor. Considered a true symbol of luxury and power, Falerno wine was only accessible to those with the greatest fortunes, since its production was limited and its quality unmatched. Wealthy Romans not only drank wine, but celebrated with it. During banquets, wine was served in golden cups, with guests delighting in the complex aromas and rich flavors that danced on their palates. On some occasions, Falerno wine was mixed with honey, spices, and even rare herbs, creating an even more sophisticated drink worthy of the highest patriarchs. And what about exclusive fruits? In ancient Rome, fruits were not just a simple meal or a common dessert, but a symbol of the abundance and status of those who consumed them. Fresh figs, pomegranates, grapes, and dates were just some of the options that adorned the tables of the elite. These fruits were grown in private gardens, tended with the greatest care and dedication, often using sophisticated methods to ensure that the flavor and quality were always exceptional. Fresh figs, for example, were extremely valued for their sweetness and soft texture, being considered a true symbol of luxury, often served with honey or fine cheeses. In addition to these more common fruits, The consumption of exotic fruits was also a clear sign of ostentation. Pomegranates, apricots, and even melons were imported from different parts of the Roman Empire, guaranteeing a feast of flavors and colors that would impress any guest. Each of these fruits was carefully chosen, representing a luxury in itself, and served with an air of sophistication that certainly made anyone feel like they were part of a unique and privileged experience. However, the most impressive thing was not only the quality of the fruits or the bread, but the significance that these delicacies had in Roman society. Unlike the simple tables of the commoners full of basic foods, the rich used these exquisite dishes as a way to show the world who they were and where they stood in terms of social status. Eating these delicacies was not only a gastronomic pleasure, but an opportunity to demonstrate power and wealth. By serving himself these delicacies, the host was not only feeding his guests, but also sending a clear message: I am someone important. Now tell me, among all these delicacies, which one would you like to try at a Roman banquet? Which part has caught your attention the most so far? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your perspective.